honored today to reintroduce Dr. Gruber. She goes by Dr. Gruber. As some of you may recall, she spoke to the World Affairs Council here nearly 3 years ago, shortly after the Brexit vote in the UK. And we wanted to get somebody to come and talk about what it all meant, what we should understand by this vote. And she did a spectacular job of it. And her talk at that point was, I think, rather pessimistic about where things were headed with that Brexit vote. And I have to say that pessimism has been amply borne out over the past 3 years. She is today a professor of politics emerita at UC Santa Cruz. She is an expert and widely published scholar in international politics and international law. She actually joined the faculty at UC Santa Cruz, go Slugs, in 1969, which was just 4 years after the campus began. So she wasn't quite there at the creation, but really close. So she was involved in a very interesting and I think very successful experiment over time. She taught in the politics department and twice chaired the department. And she also served as social science dean and academic vice chancellor, proving once again that in academia, no good deed goes unpunished. There's a split between academics going to administration. Never. Much of her work is focused on African and European affairs, with an emphasis on development politics, human rights, international law, and international institutions. Prior to teaching at UC Santa Cruz, she taught at Oberlin College in Ohio. Dr. Gruber received her PhD in political science from the University of California at Berkeley, go Bears, and her MA in international studies from the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS, in Washington, D.C. She was born in Leipzig, Germany, and immigrated to the United States at the age of 12. With Britain's October 31st, perhaps hard Brexit date fast approaching, and with all of the consequences for the not-so-united kingdom, and this is her term, the mess that is in Europe, it's a technical term, I could not think of a more timely talk that we could have today. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Gruber to speak on Europe in Turmoil.
Thank you, Glenn, and it's nice to be back. A mess indeed. Or the most recent word that came into our vocabulary was, things are absurd. I think in order to sort of zero in on what's happening now, it's useful to spend 5 minutes to see how we got there. I hate always starting with history, but in this case, I think it matters. Right after the Second World War, very close, 49, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was founded. And then by the time you got into the 1950s, 1957, 1958, the European Union was founded. In all those cases, there were sort of 3 or 4 reasons and explanations for it. One was that people said, let us never repeat the 2 world wars in the 19th century. And they tried to draw lessons from the wars in the 19th century. For example, the defeated country in this, at the end of World War I and II, Germany, ought to not be left decimated and economically deprived, because that raises nasty politics. And so you need to somehow draw, in those days, West Germany, because by that time the Cold War had split Europe. You need to draw Germany into some kind of institutional arrangements with the other West European countries, because that way you have a way of monitoring, control, and Germany. The other idea was that which is also doesn't make much sense today anymore, that economies need to be economies of scale. The idea after the Second World War was small countries could not recuperate from the Second World War because a lot of them were little countries, and that economies would have to be large economies. You wouldn't want to have steel mills in every country. You want to develop an industry in one country to serve other countries. So that had not that much to do with World War II, but it had something to do with how one thought about economics and economic development at the end of the Second World War, moving into the 1950s. A third explanation for developing these two sets of institutions was that communism was well and alive, and it's hard to remember now, but right after the Second World War, there were substantial communist parties both in France and in Italy. And so the idea was, if you're going to have democratic societies, you needed to find ways to quickly redevelop the economies of West Germany so that people would vote for democratic institutions rather than for, in this particular case, communist or any other kind of weird fascist, perhaps, institutions. Because unhappy people who don't have enough to eat, are not inclined to be very patient with the slow and messy pace of democracy. So those were sort of three things that went into the thinking. And part of the thinking, or a large part of the thinking, was the United States. Because we had a stake in rebuilding Europe quickly before communism spread all over Europe. That was a real consideration and concern. And in the reverse of it, the Europeans felt that if they attached themselves to the United States, they had a better chance of having the US military umbrella, in the case of NATO, to help protect against communism. And at the same time, the US had the economic capacity to help Europe redevelop economically. So the US was incredibly important as a factor of developing first NATO, which of course in the case of NATO included the United States and Canada, and the European Union, which occasionally was only 6 Western European countries. The European Union is now 28 countries. Lots of countries that didn't want to join originally joined, and then after the fall of communism in East Europe, many of the East European countries, and most of them, have joined as well. So that I want to really emphasize the importance of the U.S. role in all of this, because the U.S. was the umbrella which fostered the system, protected the system, encouraged the system, and even though the European Union very quickly helped develop Western Europe into vibrant economies, which turned out to be competitors to the U.S. economy, the overarching importance of keeping people together was a U.S. mission for over many presidencies, both Republican and Democratic. The other idea that was circulated throughout the thinking for the first 20, even 30, 40 years, was that one of the things that created chaos in the 19th century was nationalism. And then one of the ways to overcome, well, nationalism leading to interstate conflict, right, over a long period of time. And that one way to get rid of nationalism was to, in fact, network countries with each other so as to make it too costly to disaggregate and become nationalistic. So the idea behind the European Common Market was, among other things, that because their economies would become so integrated, it would be more costly to disengage the economies than to keep the integration of one kind or another. So it wasn't just these other three factors, it was also the idea that it was a way to overcome and prevent nationalism from re-emerging. Okay, so now we're in time 2, right? And part of what is going on in Europe, and has been going on for a decade, is that many more countries have joined. They were by and large poor countries, right? And the way the European Union operates is that when poorer countries join, resources from the richer countries help the poorer countries to equalize and to be upgraded. Because the feeling is, to operate the European Union, what you really need is some equitable distribution of lifestyles and well-being. For example, everybody needs reasonable infrastructure, everybody needs a reasonable education system, and so forth. So that it's a problem if you have, let's say, an affluent France and Germany and a very poor, that was an issue some years ago with Spain and Portugal, a very poor Spain and Portugal. In fact, some of the richer European countries, including England, were very upset that their taxpayer monies were going to Spain and Portugal to bring them up to speed. But the theory behind it, and the ideology behind it, was that the European Union would only work if countries were not, if not identical, or similar. And the European Union structured all kinds of institutions. You've been reading about them. There's a council made up of the head presidents or the representatives of heads of state. There's the commission, which is a huge bureaucracy, which is located in Brussels. There is a court. There is a central bank of Europe. So every imaginable institution was meant to help knit countries together. Two of the more recent sets of institutions, or at least treaties, one was the Schengen Treaty, which not all members of the European signed, but many did, which allowed people to just move freely. You don't have to show passports and so forth. Everybody didn't agree to join that, but in any event. Then the next step was to develop a common currency, the euro, which I think everybody here has probably traveled, and it's so great, right? You have a single currency, you can go from country to country, you constantly have to change things. But Europeans have also benefited from that. But all countries didn't want to join the euro. They wanted to have control of their own monetary policy. Now, what the central bank and what the institutions of the European Union did was to allow countries their own fiscal policies. That is to say, what they do with their people's tax money and what they spend it on locally. But they have a joint monetary policy. So think about that as our Federal Reserve, right, dealing with monetary policy, but states and Congress and so forth can legislate for, whether it goes to infrastructure or schools or whatever. So you had a kind of two-tier economic system. Countries were in control of their own domestic fiscal policies. The European Union, or those who were members of the euro, would have collective monetary policies. Well, much of this works well. Some of it sometimes doesn't work well. Most of it works really well when people are happy. But when people get unhappy, things start to fall apart and fall into disarray. What kind of unhappy? Some of the unhappy came early on, and let me just mention United Kingdom, England, Great Britain, however you want to tag it. They were not part of the original 6 of the European Union. They joined later on. And English people, right, left, and center, never really liked the European Union. Because England actually never really felt European. They were an island, we were onto ourselves, and so forth. And they convinced themselves, and the majority of the population was convinced, that it would be to their economic benefit to join the European Union. But they always had hesitation, and one of the hesitations became manifest in the fact that they wouldn't join the euro. Well, we've got our own currency. We do shillings and pounds. We don't do euros. So if you travel from Europe to England or vice versa, you know that the euro doesn't work in England and so forth. So what I just want to indicate here is that the commitment to the European Union and all aspects to it was never uniform. Some were strong supporters and defenders. A country like England, on the one hand, on the other, we don't really like it. And this was not a question of right or left even. There were all kinds of people on the left, and the Labour Party, as you probably read in the paper, who also didn't like the European Union because we're English. We're not Europeans. We're different. The Scots don't quite feel that way, but anyway. So there has never been a sort of smooth sailing. Then you have all the East European countries arrive, and why were they absorbed? Well, the reason they were absorbed was for the original reason, in some ways, that the European Union was founded to begin with, which was, if you absorb them, you might help democratize them. And you tie them in a way that they don't have national uprisings and fight with their neighbors and so forth, and they will adopt European values, American values, European values, and so forth. But they were very poor countries, which meant that a fair amount of tax money needed, collective tax money from the European Union, needed to be shifted to help those East European countries come up to par. Now, the European Union, as we have known it over the last decades, became a very complicated institution, as you can imagine. Because if, for example, you have, well, let me back up, you have two things. You have the internal common market, and then you have the external customs union. The internal common market controls all the trade and movement of things internal to the members. And the common market, that's a common market. The customs union is that it is one block of countries with respect to countries outside the customs area, right? For example, the United States, for example, Argentina, and so forth. How much tariffs they have to pay, what rules they have to follow. So there are two layers. The layer, the sort of hardcore inside are all the European Union countries. The layer is hardened for external people and their relations, and the internal relations were loosened more and more. That is to say, more and more common activities. And if you're going to say trade, take German beer and you're going to send it to Scotland, and you take Scottish scotch and you're going to send it to Germany, well, then there have to be standards, right? I'm just giving you an illustration. So, what are the standards? There are standards for every product, hundreds of thousands of standards that are built into the administration of the European Union. How much chocolate does a chocolate bar actually have? Cocoa does a chocolate bar have in it? How many hops does beer have to be in it? Every little detail about every little product is managed by rules and regulations, right? Which makes it, of course, very smooth, because if you buy, Dutch chocolate in France, you know exactly that they meet the standards of cocoa and aren't cheating and putting in, I don't know, more sugar or whatever. So these regulations are increasing, and they're by the thousands. And increasingly, as people looked around, didn't do so well economically, had to deal with these East Europeans and all the rest, they didn't like some of the regulations, especially in the UK. Why do we have to adhere to these stupid regulations that some bureaucrats in Brussels navigate and make us do? Every little, you have a little farm, let's say, somewhere in northern England, and you are wanting to sell cheese or milk or whatever, you have to adhere to all the European Union regulations about your milk, about your cheese, about every little product. And so some people resented those detailed administration. When in the United States, the current government grants against the rules. Got to get rid of the rules, environmental rules, these rules are burdensome. Well, you can imagine what the European Union looks like in terms of rules, thousands of them. And to make it even worse, there's a European court. So if you don't adhere to the regulations, there is a court which adjudicates whether or not you're at fault or whether you've been falsely accused. And increasingly, people in different countries, but very increasingly in England, people are saying, who the hell are these judges in this European court telling us what to do about selling our milk or human rights aspects or anything else? So resentment on the part of some people was that outsiders, quote unquote, of your country were in fact applying rules and regulations. So That's one thing. The other thing is that there is now a worldwide, present in the United States, present in Europe, concern and resentment on people who consider themselves losers. Small town people, shops have closed, industries have changed, their occupations have gone away, they're not doing well, the towns seem quite dead, you see no future for yourself or your children unless they go into urban areas and get a proper education. You see foreign investors coming in, they seem to be doing better than your local people. Old industries are dying, new industries are developing, new industries develop new skills and so forth. And just as in the US, where in the middle of our country and in small towns, people deeply resent the fact that the rich keep getting richer and they keep either not getting poorer or at least not making any progress. To understand the hostility in the UK or the Brexit vote and everything that's going on now, we can actually think the US. In the US, it manifests itself in being for one candidate rather than another. But there are just a lot of unhappy people who feel that they left behind. And in all the European societies, in varying degrees, the rich have become richer and the poor are not getting anywhere. Now, in some countries, it's more modest than it's in the United States and some other countries, but it leads to a lot of alienation. And that alienation is leading to wanting to blame somebody. You always have to blame somebody for your bad luck, right? It's not you who doesn't have computer skills and is unemployed or unemployable. It's got to be somebody else's fault. And one of the ways to say it's somebody else's fault is to rail against other people. Sometimes you just rail against people in your own society, a political party or some leaders. Sometimes you just rail against abstract rich people. Sometimes you rail in Europe against other countries because you feel that they're taking advantage or they're doing better than you are. And so what you've had was institutions built to counter nationalism, which are now revisiting nationalism. A new nationalism, a new looking inward, a new hostility to other people who seem to be more affluent, who are doing better. Whether that's true in all instances or not doesn't even matter. Whether you can document some of this or not doesn't even matter. What matters is that you feel you have grievances, and grievances determine your politics. Whether those grievances are based on reality or not doesn't matter a bit. So in all Western European countries and in East European countries as well, what you have is a center, a political center, and then you have extremists on the left and extremists on the right of one kind or another. And in some countries, not Western European countries as yet, unfortunately, but in some countries, the desire to have a strong man to take over to fix the system. So if you look at Hungary, if you look at Poland, if you look at Turkey, if you look at, dare we say, the United States, what people are looking for is somebody to get rid of everything that's bad, to blame somebody for it, and to be in control. So that the legislators, both inside countries and external, meaning the European Parliament, external, are confronted with the fact that they are representing increasingly people where at the margins people are unhappy, people are willing to vote in quote-unquote strong men, I suppose could be strong women as well, and that they will somehow fix it. And of course, different countries have different ideas about how it's going to be fixed. In the case of England, get out of the EU, right? Brexit. That's going to fix it. As if there aren't very many economists who think England is going to be better off after England leaves the European Union. In fact, almost every economist believes it's going to be worse, right? But you believe in the fact that you finally acted. You voted for Farage, and Farage told you that the Europeans are the ones that are making your life miserable, and that you want out. And once England is control, or Great Britain is control of itself, then we will restore things and things will be well. It doesn't matter how many people say, no, 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 this is not going to happen. What you need to do with the European Union is reform it, because institutions always get out of date and they need to be reformed. No, 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 we don't want reform. What we want is out. So there's a strong feeling of people wanting out of something. Or at least to listen to somebody who says that I have the answer. Because bureaucrats, generally speaking, saying, well, this is very complex on the one hand, on the other, we can tinker here, we can tinker there, it's going to take a long time, which feels very unsatisfactory when you are believing that something needs to be done in a hurry. Now, in addition to all of this turmoil in Europe, what you have is the US essentially no longer serving as an umbrella to foster the system. If you, that is to say, one of the hallmarks of both Democrats and Republicans was the strong support of NATO and the European Union. We now have a president who supports neither. Trump said the other day, NATO, never mind NATO, certainly the European Union can't blame England for wanting to get out, and so forth. And you can say, well, who cares about the US? Well, lots of people care. The first thing is that, of course, we were the power behind the whole NATO operations, right? And what we're currently doing is saying, well, NATO is really sort of a schlock organization because people aren't paying what they're supposed to be paid, right? First of all, that's only half true, but we can talk about the details of that. The second thing is, the current administration, certainly President Trump, feels very strongly that he would certainly not want to be part of the European Union and a collective court and the bureaucracy and all of that. Can't blame people for wanting to get out from under it. Now we can say, we in the United States, whether we're right, left, or center politically, why should they all care? Because, as used to be said, the US was the essential country to make this all work. Right? We didn't participate necessarily in everything, but we were considered the essential supporter of allowing the Europe to rebuild, to develop, to be peaceful, to integrate the East European countries and so forth. And now we've pulled the rug out from under them. And that is further weakening those in Europe who say, okay, let's reform these institutions and update them, but they're very necessary. That rug has been pulled out from under them because there's not much US support for them. And in fact, there's US hostility to some of this at the moment. And at the same time, the military side, the NATO side, everybody now feels insecure whether in fact the US would make good on the NATO treaty commitment, namely that an attack on one is an attack on all, right? Because that, by the way, is how Europeans got into helping us in Afghanistan, because that was considered an attack on the United States, and the response was all European countries stepped up to the plate and helped the US in one way or another, either with military or personnel or other things, right? The current administration has made it clear that if there was an attack on a NATO country, we would think about it. And the attack on one is an attack on all. The automaticity of it was considered to be the deterrent. If you have to think about it, somebody might say, well, we can risk it, because maybe they'll come to the defense, maybe they won't. Let's risk it. And they might not. So the US role, or lack thereof right now, is playing an incredibly important part in the whole sort of unraveling of the system, the insecurity of the system in Europe, both with respect to European Union and to NATO. Now, I want to spend a couple of minutes before the questions about what's happening inside some of the European countries. And if you look at the paper, you see that the Italian government has just fallen apart. And the Italian government, to begin with, was iffy. It was the extreme right and the extreme sort of populist, disorganized left, right? And now who's going to take over? In the case of Britain, the largest vote recently for anybody in Britain was for Farage, who is the one who initiated the Brexit, right? So the unhappy people came out to vote for Brexit. It is totally unclear if an election is a vote is called in Parliament, which is a no-confidence vote for crashing out of Brexit, whether at that particular point, if it goes to a national election, what will happen, right? Because you have extremes on both sides. The mainstream party, both the Conservative and Labour Party, are in total disarray. And that is not unrepresentative of what's happening in other countries. The two center parties in Germany have lost votes to the Greens and to the more right-wing ADF. In many countries, the centrist parties, slightly to the center of the right, to the left, are the ones that have governed for the last decades. And all of them, almost all of them, are in current disarray. And so you have a disintegration inside European countries of what would be considered the center, a reasonable center. And it also is the case that even though some countries were multi-party countries, for example, Italy, France, Germany, and so forth, essentially since the Second World War, the two centrist parties have ruled, either in coalition or by themselves with some other small parties. As they've become weakened, you now have a situation where tiny small parties can make bargains with slightly larger groups in order to govern. And in order to make the bargain, they move them either to the extreme right or the extreme left. Right? So it's not simply that the post-World War II interstate structure has frayed, but it's also the case that the domestic politics in many of the European countries is in very serious disarray. And this is very dangerous business. And, you know, the causes, of course, that I've talked about so far have excluded the immigration business. Because one of the variables that has driven people to oppose centrist parties and has led to right-wing, in some cases even fascist parties, is the opposition to having immigrants. Well, we have our own version of that here, as a matter of fact. But in Europe, don't forget that most European countries were very homogeneous countries, single cultural homogeneous countries. And by introducing a substantial number of immigrants with different cultures, different religions, you of course change the nature of society, much more so than in our case where we're used to, you know, a long history of in due course incorporating people and merging them as Americans, right? It's even, take the most sort of liberal, democratic Sweden, which God knows, per capita, admitted more immigrants than any other country per capita out of the conflicts in the Middle East and Afghanistan and so forth. You know, do we really need all these Eritreans and Somalis hanging around Stockholm? What are they about anyway? They're not Lutherans. Should we be building mosques in Stockholm? Are they learning Swedish? Unlike in the United States, the Swedes immediately set up wonderful schools, transition schools, taught everybody English, this, that, and the other thing. They did all the things that a textbook would say should be done, and we often don't do, right? And still, people in Sweden are saying, really, Sweden is going to look different in the future, right? People will intermarry, you know, brown people will integrate with, you know, us Viking people or whatever. So the problem is that Europe is changing because of immigration. But Europe is also going to change because of aging out. We're aging out less because of our immigrant population, because immigrants tend to have more children than non-immigrants. But in Europe, in Italy, Spain, other European countries, Hungary, Germany, whatever, they won't have enough labor to run their economies anymore, depending on which country, 20, 25 years. They're simply, it's not just true in Europe, it's true in Japan, it's true in South Korea. People are not replicating themselves. So if a single married couple has only one child, you are not replicating yourself. And if you don't have children at all, which increasingly many women around the world aren't having children for one reason or another, they just don't want them. That then leads to a population which has to import labor. It's at the forefront in Japan, which is not part of my topic, where they already have to bring in hundreds of thousands of workers, temporary workers from the Philippines and so forth, to do much of the things that the Japanese neither want to do nor have enough labor to do, right? And increasingly that's happening throughout Europe. So not getting adjusted to bringing in people from around the world willing to come and work and settle is a very short-sighted problem. But when you are living in the North English town, which industry has left, where everybody's unemployed, it's not all that different than if you live in a similar town in Nebraska, where all the stores have shut, where if people buy anything, they buy it on Amazon, or they travel someplace to go to Walmart, or whatever, all the small shops. What we have discovered, by we I mean sociologists have discovered, is you bring in 3, 4 immigrant families, and lo and behold, they are running the motel, they are running the small shops, they are profitable, and all of a sudden the town comes back alive. Now, our politics doesn't acknowledge that either, right? We don't acknowledge that these people coming over the border are in fact needed throughout the United States for labor to reinvigorate small towns. But that's us, an immigrant country. You can imagine non-immigrant countries and how they respond to that very negatively. So that too is driving right-wing politics and wanting out from arrangements which actually benefit you, but which you blame for your economic dislocation. Right? So, yet again, I'm painting a very bleak picture from 3 years ago, but with actually a new twist, namely, the disintegration or the possible disintegration of some of Europe has progressed over the 3 years. The politics inside European countries has gotten far worse. That is to say, dictators, right-wing, left-wing, authoritarian leaders running governments. And finally, I think the third leg of this is the U.S. no longer playing a lead role in sustaining the system that it helped build, encouraging countries to stay in, and so forth. We've essentially, right, America first, the hell with all these other people and other societies, we don't need them, we're all powerful, and so forth. So everything that was collective imagination at the end of the Second World War, and which helped build stability, is now unraveling, including, as you might have noticed, the missile treaties and everything else. We blame somebody else, but, you know, I'm not saying anybody else is not blameworthy, but the fact is, we're essentially getting out of all multinational arrangements. Our current government, which you might support or not support, is essentially opposed to multinationalism. Whether it's NAFTA, whether it's the Trans-Pacific Treaty, whether it's the climate treaty, whether it's support of the EU, whether it's NATO, whatever it is, we're essentially against it. We are in a kind of an isolationist mode, which of course is very weird because we're a global power entirely dependent on our globalization. But the politics of it is that, and it is withdrawing. And as Americans, I think we should really be concerned. On the one hand, we should praise ourselves of having created a system in Europe which really worked for 50 years and which was very promising. And now I think we have to blame ourselves for supporting the idea that the US participates in the unraveling of this particular system. So I've thrown out a lot of stuff. Why don't we move to questions?
All right, we'll start on this side. Do we have any questions over here?
A more specific question with regard to Prime Minister Mitsotakis in Greece, who is relatively new, I believe, has a big challenge and has, I guess, promised that he's going to take care of tax evasion, corruption, bureaucracy, and all that business, which has always been seems like a lifelong problem for Greece. Is there any chance that he's going to be successful and get it to a point where the EU is not going to have to bail him out again, or what does it look like?
You know, that's a good question. I mean, he is a kind of extremely well-trained, American-trained, as a matter of fact, he went to Harvard, economist, who is slightly right of center, replacing a government that was quite a bit left of center. And I don't think that he can make good on everything he said, but it is not unreasonable to assume that he will make improvements in the economy. And, you know, people who are unhappy want quick fixes, and I don't think there's a quick fix to Greece, but there's certainly steps that can be taken. And as long as he has the support of a lot of Greeks, which I think he will have at least for a year, he might be able to make some inroads. And of course, you raise the question of bailing out, right? I mean, one of the problems of that the Brexiteers will argue is that our, you know, tax money goes to bail out, you know, people who mismanage their economies. That, by the way, is also the strong position of Germans who oppose the government. They are saying, you know, we're the rich country and we have to bail out these poor countries. To begin with, I just want to say, and it's slightly off your question, that the Farage and the Brexiteers were, to put it diplomatically, dishonest in saying how much money England was having to pour in to bail people out. There was a lot of sleight of hand there. So the fact that, you know, the unemployed English person in Northern England is poor because his tax money is all going to Greece and so forth isn't quite true. But still, poor countries need to be bailed out. And the good illustration of the benefits of bailing people out, especially when they're decent policymakers, are in fact Spain and Portugal, which are both doing rather well. In fact, Spain is one of the high performing countries right now, and they sure needed bailing out when they became democratic countries, right? Tons, and people objected. So I think that, going back to your question, I think he will manage to make some improvements. Whether they're fast enough, I can't say. But he certainly would have, you know, he has both the background and the support at the moment to make some changes. And none of these things can be done overnight. So it's a question of how much time people give him, whether it's a year or two.
Next question over here.
Professor, I haven't heard you mention Mr. Putin or the Russian Federation. Would you say something about how you see their influence on NATO and on European disintegration in the coming 5 years?
Yes, well, hold up, huge topic. Let it be said that Putin's aims in Europe are not all that different from his aims in the United States. Intervene wherever you can, undermine wherever you can, get revenge against what was the attitude very much in the United States and also some other countries, which was, we've won, right? In '89, we walked around, God, we've won, we've defeated them, and so forth. A great historical country like Russia does not want to, you know, feel that it's done in, so to speak. And so Putin, among other things, I mean, he's a nasty dictator, as we know, and all the rest, but Putin, among other things, has the support of Russian people of saying, you know, we want revenge here. And the way we get a revenge is to intervene in other people's affairs and bring them, have their institutions, which they're so proud of, disintegrate. And it's done over the internet, it's done through the payment of groups. He doesn't care whether you're supporting right-wing or left-wing groups as long as they can do the government in and create chaos. I think it's going to get worse. I see no particular light at the end of this tunnel, and I think it will only get better when, in the case of the United States, we admit what's happening and try to counteract it rather than pretending it doesn't exist. And in the case of Europe, if they can keep their act together and not disintegrate over Brexit and other things, have the NATO being done in by the United States, then there is some strength to counter all of that. But I certainly don't think he's about to go away, or that the Russian problem is about to go away. And of course now we also have China enter into the fray, right? So it's getting complicated. And getting complicated means, among other things, you need really smart people who know what they're doing. What you don't want is neophytes running countries. I mean, you have a comedian who is now in charge of the Ukraine. You have, God knows, President Trump, who can't find Yemen on the map. You have a State Department that has been decimated. A third of all the top people in the State Department are gone. You have acting people all over the place. You have Europe in sufficient disarray that the most experienced people haven't been elected to those new posts that they've just had election for, head of the Council and Commission. So you've had compromised candidates because of the internal politics and so forth. I mean, the people actually aren't bad, but they're not, they could have been even better, is I guess what I'm saying. So unless Europe and the United States gets its own house in order and recognizes that diplomacy and international politics is not just some sort of avocation on weekends, but is in fact central to an interdependent world, and that you can't disaggregate an interdependent world completely, because, the idea was, all right, so you imported cars, and now you don't want to import cars, and so you're going to make your own cars, and your economy is going to be better. And what's forgotten is that cars are made up of bits and pieces that are made in different countries and get traded around, and almost nothing is wholly made in one country anymore. And so you have to have open trade and not have trade barriers. For example, I just keep throwing stuff out, I apologize. There's something called the World Trade Organization, which is meant to monitor, it's a global organization, it's meant to monitor trade, right? And like many other international institutions, it's frayed and it needs to be reformed and so forth, but it doesn't need to be done in. Well, we in the United States are about to do it in, because we refuse to appoint judges, which are the ones that adjudicate trade disputes. Right? So you just say, we'll do that. I don't believe in NATO, says Trump. Let's not appoint any judges there. And that means NATO can't operate. And NATO is supposed to make sure that the trade is fair and that, whatever the case may be. So the international institutions, whether they're regional or global, I want to say, all developed over some decades and certainly need reform in the 21st century, each in different ways. But what they don't need is being scrapped. It is very foolhardy to go back to sovereign countries with hard borders in some senses, keeping people out, not managing your own population, and at the end of the day, everybody will suffer. If we continue the way we are, in 10 years' time, I'd be too old to come back, but in any event, I will come to you and say, see, the whole international system that was slowly built over some decades has been disintegrated. And it's disintegrated not so much of its own weight, but because of policies of various policymakers who were voted in by voters in democratic ways, who were dissatisfied, who didn't understand what their dissatisfaction was based on or how to fix it, and decided to blame others. It's always nice to blame somebody else.
Go back here. Thank you. There are two major issues I feel you kind of underemphasized. One was immigration within the EU. When you talk to the Brits, you find out that a person living in the EU can live anywhere they want to. So the borders of Britain to the new Eastern European were open. Anybody could come. And this created a huge migration into the wealthier countries, which created the usual, I don't like them. The other one is that the economic structure of the EU allowed the individual countries to operate in a negative financial position. So Greece, Spain, Portugal all got into big trouble, whereas within the United States, a state must operate on a balanced budget. So they've got to face up to either cutting services or increasing money. These European countries didn't have to, and all of a sudden they do. So I think those were two major issues. In addition to regulation.
So let me take the second one first. I mean, as it happens, we are in a huge deficit spiral, and whether you live, no matter what state you live in, this is going to harm you. As the trillions pile up, not just because we have Medicare or whatever, the trillions are piling up for a whole host of complicated reasons. It means that we're not building infrastructure. If we're not building infrastructure, people can't flourish, industries can move, and so forth. So it's not just the Europeans. The other thing is, of course, you mentioned Spain in particular. Spain and Portugal did get a lot of resources, but they are now doing better than UK and other European countries. So one has to, in terms of Greece, one has to say to oneself, is it worth bailing them out so that they can be standing on their own legs and actually contribute something? And as a matter of fact, Greece gets a bad rap, not by those of us who are tourists there, because it's lovely, but gets a bad rap because, as you know, you probably know, the European Union has made a lot of deals with Greece, so that Greece and Turkey, so that Greece doesn't get completely inundated with refugees from Syria and so forth, and many of them stay in Turkey. So there are all kinds of deals out there to manage the population. It's interesting that you mentioned East Europeans in regard to the UK. There are kind of two things. One is that there's something called the Schengen Treaty or Protocol, which allows people to, once they set foot somewhere in Europe, to freely move around anywhere in Europe. And England, UK is not a member of that, so they have more control than some other countries. The other thing is that most of what you hear in the US and much of what you even hear about Europe is people coming from the Middle East and Africa and how they're culturally different and how can we integrate them and how can we make Italians out of Ghanaians or something. But the East Europeans who came in droves, Poles, Romanians, Bulgarians, in a funny sort of way, did not become a burden to the English economy, because by the time they arrived, England hardly had any plumbers or electricians or anybody who could fix anything. And if you lived in England and you called an electrician or a plumber, chances are an East European would show up, right? What the English didn't like was that your English stores, which maybe had some Indian products in it, all of a sudden had shelves marked for Polish food, right? And so what is this Polish stuff doing here? Many of the East Europeans actually stayed a while and went home. They had no inclination to stay there. Unlike other immigrants who come from fairly hopeless countries who will hope to stay, the East Europeans, by and large, stayed temporarily and then repatriated back to their own country. So actually, in the most recent years, more Poles and Romanians and Bulgarians have actually gone back rather than stayed. So they perceive this as a temporary way to get employment, to make some money, to go back home and go back on the farm or run your business or whatever. So you have two types of immigrants: the sort of temporary worker immigrants, who who don't intend to stay, versus those that are the kind of immigrants, what many of us, our ancestors, whatever, were, which mean they were refugees from somewhere. They came, they intended to stay, and they became Americans. Some European countries who were colonial countries had more experience than others. For example, both in France and the UK, they were used to people in their colonial empires coming to stay in their countries. They learned the languages, they stayed, they often intermarried and so forth, and they're considered part of the society. Versus the current lot, which are people who are victims of climate change in all the warm countries. People can't farm anymore, whether it's in Central America or in Africa. Disarray of wars like Syria and so forth. So you need to, I think we need to disaggregate people who move. Why they move, are they going to stay, are they there temporarily, are they needed to be there temporarily, and what happens if they're there temporarily and have children. And that's a current issue in the US because President Trump wants to get rid of a historic, always in the United States, if you're born here, you're a citizen. And Trump wants to get rid of that. I think there are going to be court battles over that, but in any event. I mean, that has been a hallmark of the US. You come to the US, your children, if they're born here, they are American citizens, right? In many European countries, that's not the case. Your citizenship is dependent on bloodlines. Right? And that was true for decades and generations. In some countries, they now have, in international law, there is citizenship by birth, citizenship by law. And we were one of the few countries, immigration countries in the world, had citizenship by birth. Many European countries had citizenship by law, right? But that's getting more mixed up now.
We have a lineup of 3 questions, so hopefully we get them all in.
Zeroing in on the question of Brexit, what's your prognosis of what's going to happen on October 31st? Is the release of the recent secret report about its possible impacts really going to have an impact on it? And do you think there's any possibility that they could revote the question?
All of the above. I have no idea what's going to happen. What may happen is that there will be a vote in Parliament against crashing out. I think Boris Johnson is getting ready for an election. What will happen in the election, who knows? I think I'd be foolish to predict it. I think no one in England can predict it at the moment that I read about. It is crazy and don't know. I just have no answer. It is a total mystery because the party system in England has disintegrated. Both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party are a total mess. And unlike other countries, England does not have a written constitution. It is unclear how this can be resolved. And people are even talking about having to go to the Queen to make a decision. You can imagine the 93-year-old Queen who's never had to make a political decision in her life, now being told it's up to you. I mean, there's serious talk about that. So I'm the last one to predict the question. Sorry about that. I know you hoped I would say something, but...
Related to the Brexit question, I have 2 questions, one on Scotland and one on Ireland. If Scotland will have another referendum on independence and say that they passed the referendum on independence, this time will Scotland be admitted to the EU? The second question is, will Brexit hasten the unification of Ireland?
Those are 2 really good questions. I think Scotland will be admitted. It will take some time, because it always takes some time. And in the case of Ireland, I think if there is no resolution to the border issue, I think the first thing you will see is more conflict in Northern Ireland, because you will get the Protestant Catholic, the settlement will get unsettled in some ways. And I think somewhere down the road, the 2 Irelands will get together and they'll be part of the EU. And I can even imagine that Wales, which voted for Brexit by and large, eventually splitting off. That is to say, the United Kingdom will get disaggregated. And whether, if you are in England, you think this is a good thing. I mean, you were once this big colonial power running the world, and now you're going to shrink into little England. I think if this happens, they'll be very sorry. But it's sad. It is very sad.
And one last question.
I'm interested in power blocks. What I mean by that is the religious entities around the world, Shiite, Sunni, Orthodox Christians, Russian Orthodox, evangelists. Are these people powerful forces, or should we be moving towards secularization?
Well, Europe as all of it, moved to secularization just like the US did, which means that the people who were religiously serious in various things became defensive and locked into whether it's evangelical or orthodox, this or that. That was in many ways already a response to the secularization of much of society. Right? And Europe in general in the post-World War period became very secular. Very secular. Now, the question then arises when you have, Muslims arrive, Shiites and Sunnis and all the other various religions around the world. How serious one wants to take their serious religious politics. And I'm of the opinion that it's as much political as it is religious. Let us say, if you really look at the younger generations in Iran and Turkey and so forth, they're also quite secular, but they're forced into those roles. And so, but the religions are used just like they were used in ancient European times as political cuddles to get what you want to get. Right? So the more regularized people become, the more economically viable they become. I bet you anything the next generation will not all be joining ISIS, but will rather be living would prefer to live a middle-class life no matter where they happen to be. But if you're attacked, and everything about your culture is attacked, and you say nasty things about people, then of course they will dig in. And what is their identity? Their identity is not just that they speak Arabic, but they're Shiites, or they're Sunnis, or they're this, or they're that. And so these become identities. These identities can be dissolved, but they can only be dissolved through reasonable economics and politics, as far as I can see. And the fear that we have, and the insults we throw out at people, does not understand that amongst, let's say, below the layer in Iran and Turkey and so forth, is a huge burgeoning younger population, because their populations are very young, which would just as soon get rid of this whole thing and be quite secular. And the irony is, under all the garb that the women have to wear and so forth, underneath they're wearing hot pants and makeup, and at night they dance to rock and roll, right? So I think one needs to be very careful. It's not inaccurate to describe the situation as it is right now, but not to imagine that it has deep and broad roots that will always be there. And just think Catholics and Protestants and whatever over history.
Well, thank you, Professor Gruber.